The first time I encountered hummingbirds, I was 8 years old. They entranced me so completely that I still remember them now vividly, half a century later. It happened in London, not a place usually associated with these little tropical beauties. My visit to the UK's capital was daunting, verging on the overwhelming. It was the first time I'd been out of Ulster. The density of people, the city's endless streets and bustling humanity, the perpetual streams of traffic, roads and buildings clogging every view and stretching to the horizon. London blotted out the possibility of fields or forests. It even seemed to shrink the sky. The sheer size of the place came as a shock after the small scale I was used to from growing up in County Antrim. The hummingbirds punctuated a rare moment of tranquility in that jarring week of rushing between famous sites, jostled everywhere by crowds. We were visiting the London Zoo. A door in one of the aviaries led into what seemed like an indoor garden, a glass house planted out with exotic ferns and flowers. It was hot enough to suggest a jungle. At first, it was just the temperature, humidity, and lushness of the vegetation that struck me. I was expecting more cages, and when I saw none, wondered if we'd inadvertently strayed out of the animal part of the zoo into some purely botanical display. Then, with a whispered whir of brilliant wings, a hummingbird flew so close to me it made me start. Soon another followed it, and to my delighted amazement, I realized we were in an area in which lots of hummingbirds were flying free. They hovered at nectar feeders and then shot away again, only to flit back moments later. By incredible good fortune, we'd coincided with a quiet time. Despite the crowds of visitors thronging the zoo, it was only me, my brother, and our parents in that enchanted green oasis. The four of us alone with scores of iridescent hummingbirds. The place felt like a sanctum, veined with streaks of resplendent flight that fractured our accustomed measures of motion and colour, suggesting a radically redrawn scale. It went so far beyond what we were used to that it shimmered with the promise of numinous impossibilities. After witnessing the constraints of creatures held in dismally cramped imprisonment, the freedom of this place was magical. The hummingbirds could fly all around us, into us if they so desired. There were no barriers between people and birds. They were enclosed, of course, but their tininess, the space afforded by the glass house, and the fact that we were free to walk among them without constraint, to be in their cage that didn't seem a cage right beside them, gave an air of immediacy that was breathtaking. I've always been interested in birds, but at 8 years old, my avian reference range was modest and parochial, defined by robins, sparrows, starlings, thrushes, blackbirds, Ireland's common species that we saw often in our suburban garden. To be suddenly surrounded by these exquisite rarities, to be close enough to observe in detail the astonishing grace and energy implicit in their every movement, to see the fantastic richness of their plumage, was a kind of epiphany. I was spellbound. I stood stock still and let their unexpected presence claim me. Not surprisingly, that moment pressed its weight of passing on my mind with sufficient force to forge a lasting memory. In fact, what I remember most from that first visit to London isn't the changing of the guard at Buckingham Palace or Big Ben or the Houses of Parliament or the Crown Jewels or any of the other famous sights, but being surrounded and left awed by hummingbirds. Years later, I happened to be reading Annie Dillard's An American Childhood and was profoundly struck when she described how settlers in Pennsylvania in the 18th century pressed hummingbirds as if they were flowers between the pages of heavy books, and then enclosed them in letters to friends and family back home in Ulster or Scotland. In part, of course, it was simply Dillard's mention of Ulster that caught my eye. As someone born and brought up there, I know that Ulster is often seen by outsiders as a dour and cheerless place, lacking in warmth or vibrancy or colour. I'd not endorse that stereotype. But at the same time, I can well imagine how a hummingbird might strike an emigrant. why they'd want to send home tangible proof of the new world that they'd come to and the marvels it contained. The stunning iridescence of these birds, their rich arrays of sumptuous colour, their unlikely littleness, the intricate perfection of their flight. It's easy to see how those who'd grown up with sparrows might take them as splinters of a miracle, fragments of another world erupting into this one, tokens of something wonderful. Pressing hummingbirds struck me as at once grotesque and entirely understandable. I readily sympathised with those Pennsylvanian settlers, newly arrived in a foreign place and encountering things that they'd never dreamt of. What could be more natural than wanting to send irrefutable evidence of their revelations to those who might disbelieve them? And of course, Dillard's vignette immediately called back to mind my first visit to London. I knew that my 8-year-old self would have seized any opportunity to take away some memento of those treasured moments in a glasshouse filled with such astonishing bounty. Essentially, the pages that follow are about hummingbirds, not the literal feathered morsels that can be pressed like flowers in heavy books, but their metaphorical equivalents. These may not be iridescent or chromatically sublime. They may not move with the same graceful perfection of real hummingbirds, but all of them have stopped me in my tracks, glinting with the suggestion of meanings beyond the commonplace. They've left me as spellbound and wondering before them as my 8-year-old self was before those little feathered gems. Some of my metaphorical hummingbirds are far too heavy ever to take flight. A railway cross tie, for example, or a bronze statuette of the Buddha. Some are abstract and invisible, time, death, and memory. Some hide in unlikely objects, seashells, an ugly clock, old photographs. Some are disguised as other birds, wood pigeons or blue tits, for example. Some as other creatures altogether, butterflies and foxes. But all of them are hummingbird-like in the way they offer unexpected challenges to the mundane scales by which we measure things. They suggest new calibrations in terms of meaning, connection, and significance, as surely as the London hummingbird suggested a different scale for colour. Like pressing hummingbirds, what I've written tries to catch and preserve, and via publication mail far beyond Ulster, some of the things that have flown through my days and left me feeling that I'm standing on the frontier of the ordinary, being given glimpses of the extraordinary dimensions it contains. It's as if doors had been opened into a secret, unexpected glasshouse hidden in plain sight, whose denizens mock our usual categories and confinements. It's risky, I know, to use something as exquisite as a hummingbird as a point of comparison by which to explain the nature of a book. Beside them, words look heavy, clumsy, colourless. Instead of the intricate perfection of form and motion that's so evident in these aerodynamic jewels, sentences seem lumbering. Even the most poetic of them can appear as plodding parodies of a hummingbird's poise and grace. Like pressing, writing can reduce things to a faded husk, something emptied of its life and beauty and smacking of the mortuary. I hope my words avoid this, but I certainly don't want to suggest that they possess the brilliancy of colour or artistry of flight that real hummingbirds so effortlessly display. It's simply that the keepsakes I've pressed into form in words and assembled here are things that caught my attention as compellingly as those free-flying birds did on my first visit to London Zoo. Also, colour and iridescence apart, in terms of their small scale and the way in which they move, forwards, backwards, hovering, meandering, moving from one thing to another and then back again, hummingbirds offer a pleasing totem for writing that likes to dart and wander rather than following some ruled line that's straight as the proverbial crow's flight. Dillard's description of mailing pressed hummingbirds back to Ulster didn't make the impression that it did, solely because it mentioned my homeland and reminded me of my London hummingbirds. As well as being an Ulsterman, I'm an essayist, and what those 18th century Pennsylvanian settlers did struck a potent chord with what I'm attempting in my essays. Like them, I want to place between the pages of books things I find eye-catching. Like pressing, writing tries to preserve in a communicable form things that seem sufficiently arresting to want to bring to the attention of others. To admit to being an essayist is even riskier than comparing writing to something as beautiful as a hummingbird. Conventional publishing wisdom advises authors to avoid the term essay. There is a preference for creative non-fiction, memoir, even meditation, anything that avoids the dreaded E word. Readers prefer, or are perceived by publishers to prefer, a book that consists of serial chapters, not freestanding essays. They want something that obeys the niceties of predictable progression, moving from beginning to middle to end, with everything neatly linked together, introduced, resolved, and concluded. But I'm reminded of the sentiment expressed by the nameless protagonist in the opening paragraph of Flann O'Brien's At Swim Two Birds. One beginning and one ending for a book was a thing I did not agree with. A good book may have 3 openings entirely dissimilar and interrelated only in the prescience of the author, or for that matter, 100 times as many endings. I've arranged Hummingbirds between the pages so that, to my mind, its contents sit easily together. But there's no singular beginning of the kind that O'Brien's hero condemns. There's no compelling reason for readers to start at the first page and read consecutively to the final one. Each of the book's constituent essays is independently intelligible and can be considered on its own and in any order. Though I like to think that assembled together, the essays gather cumulative momentum, draw strength from one another, that their proximity sets off echoes and resonances, that their voices speaking together companionably reiterate and reinforce common concerns, and offer sets of creative variations on the themes addressed. In an essay about essays, provocatively entitled In Defense of Incoherence, E.J. Levy writes that the form doesn't lend itself to mass market sales. But, she says, that is precisely its charm and our pleasure in reading it. In her view, part of the appeal of this ancient but now ill-served genre lies in the fact that it provides a respite from the clamour of commerce. In putting together collections, she urges essayists to resist the temptation of presenting their work in a way that obscures the individual independence of each piece, or gives the impression that essays can be subsumed beneath some organizing principle that pretends there's an overarching structure within which they unfold quite logically, one by one, following the expectations of linearity. The first impulse that brought us to the essay form, Levy reminds us, is art. And art, she says, is not about the market or clever formal conceits or even publication, but about wonder. I hope my Hummingbirds will not be read as an attempt to foist on the inevitable plurality of a collection an organizing principle that tries to force them into neat singularity following a step-by-step progression. This is something my essays just don't do. I reached for Hummingbirds instinctively, simply because my experience of them, like my experience of writing essays, is rooted in wonder.